quite a welcome. I do a lot of speaking, but I've never had an orchestra introduce me, so thank you very much. And thank you to OBOS for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in Oslo. So today I'm going to talk to you about green building and our work all around the world, but also here in Norway with the Norway Green Building Council. And really the title of my talk today is Green Homes, Better Places for People. And we're going to talk about why building green is better for all of us, both today and tomorrow, both now and in the future. But first, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my childhood in Canada, and I promise you it's relevant. This is a national park a little outside of Toronto, where I grew up, and this is where we'd spend our summers. I come from my mother's Dutch. We come from a Dutch family, and we'd all go up to this campsite, and we'd spend our summers basically living outside, and we'd stay in tents, often with the zippers open, and we'd spend all day in this lake swimming, and it was a pretty idyllic way to grow up. Then I got a bit older, and a tradition in Canada when you're a teenager is that you get away from your parents for the summer and go to summer camp. And it was similar. I got to stay in a cabin like this where the flaps would open at night. So on a hot day, you'd feel the cool breeze, and you'd be basically living outside, surrounded by the trees. Your laundry would dry naturally right outside of your tent, and it was a pretty amazing way to spend the summer. And then I got a bit older, and I did some backpacking, and I developed a bit of an obsession with tree houses. And I stayed in this 90-foot tree house, which is in Kerala, India, where you basically wake up and you kind of peer outside into the trees and the Malabar squirrels that are there, and you have to be winched up in a bucket to get there. It was pretty amazing. And then I got a bit older, and I had to take my first office job in the summer. And this is where I got to spend my summer. So you can imagine how I felt being in a building like this. Terrible fluorescent lighting, no access to daylight, terrible carpet, whose noxious fumes I'm sure I was inhaling. The whole situation was pretty miserable. And then I got a bit older, and I started working in climate change, and I worked for an organization called the C40 Cities, of which Oslo is a part, and I learned much more about the impact that those buildings were having. And not only did I feel miserable being in a building like that, I felt miserable about those buildings because this is what those buildings were doing. Those buildings were contributing to pollution, to dangerous greenhouse gas emissions, and those buildings were, and still are, contributing to catastrophic climate change. And lately we've been experiencing those extreme storms, the extreme weather that really is being driven by the increase in global temperatures. So this is really my journey to green building. And when I joined the World Green Building Council 2.5 years ago, we really made it our mission to change this, to change both the way that we feel in a building, but also the way that we feel about buildings. So last week, my team actually got to go to my sister's kindergarten class in Canada and try and explain to the children, they're about 5 years old, what we mean by a green home. And this was a great exercise because so often we talk to folks like yourselves, to developers and others, and we get really technical. But what we really needed to explain to these kids is that a greenhouse is a happy house. So they all drew these pictures about what they felt to be a happy house. And those happy houses were positively impacting the environment, but also the people within it. They felt happy about their home because they're green homes. And this is really what we mean when we talk about green buildings. So I'm going to talk a little bit more today about the future of green homes and some really important trends that we're seeing, which answer some of the questions we heard at the beginning. Why should we build green? How can we get more developers building green? How can we build the business case for building green? And a couple of key points. Healthy buildings are the new must-have. Millennials are demanding a new way of life, And this is really driving an acceleration of the green building and the green homes market we're seeing all around the world. The health and wellness trend is really big, and I'm sure all of you in this room have experienced parts of it. The move towards clean eating, your activities that you're doing every day, contributing to your health and well-being. And McKinsey and Company has studied the market, and they're saying this is the next $1 trillion market that they are tapping into, that so many people around the world are becoming more and more obsessed with how everything that they do, they touch, they eat, is contributing to how they feel, how their health and their overall well-being, their mental state. And this isn't just about those products. This also extends to our environment. And Deepak Chopra, you might have heard of, he's a big health and wellness guru. And he says what we call the environment is our extended body. You can't sustain one without the other. And this is where the green homes and green buildings come in. We spend 90% of our time in buildings. The move towards health and well-being is obvious that it's becoming a part of also the green building movement. I recently moved and I was flipping through an Elle decoration magazine getting ideas for my new house. And actually what I picked up was the health and well-being edition of a mainstream interior decorating magazine. It's a bit hard to read, but the hot list Well-Being at Home had a whole section listing 42 features that you could incorporate into your home that would improve your own health and well-being. Better access to daylight, better ventilation, beautiful plants that actually clean the air while you sleep. These were all featured in a major magazine. There are other trends that are also related. How good night's sleep, these are all headlines from magazines. How a good night's sleep is becoming the ultimate status symbol. People understand now that you need 8 hours of sleep. And this relates to the type of home you live in also. London homebuyers are looking for property in areas with low pollution. They're understanding now the links between air pollution, both indoor and outdoor, and health problems like asthma. Wearables are becoming a big deal in Asia, particularly in places where air quality is an issue. They're actually using their phones, their mobiles, and apps to measure the air quality in the buildings where they're working and living, to assess how maybe their health is being affected by their surroundings. China's building the world's first vertical forest city to help clean up its pollution problem. Also understanding how green, meaning living, really can affect actually the quality of the air around you. So these are some trends, and recently at World Green Building Council, in the last couple of years, we've done more and more work on this, more and more thinking and analysis about what are some of the features that make a building or a home healthy, and how do those relate to those that also are environmental attributes, so attributes that are improving the environmental qualities and performance of a building. And we've really identified about 8 features of a healthy building. One is thermal comfort. Are you too hot, too cold? This is often a complaint, both maybe when you live with your partner at home, but also in the office. There's a constant tug of war over the thermostat. Indoor air quality, this is more and more important, and I'll come on to some studies that talk about the importance of the levels of CO2, but also some of the noxious fumes that may exist within the air and how those might be affecting you. Daylight and lighting. Access to daylight is being recognized as increasingly important, maybe not great in this room that we're in right now. Noise and acoustics, the interior layout, and active design. How are you building your maybe office or even your home so that it encourages you to be active? Are you moving around, or are you sitting the whole day? Biophilia, a big word for just having plants and being close to nature. Look and feel of a place, and the location and access, which is a critical part of what makes a healthy home. You can't just have a healthy home inside and not be thinking about how that home is situated. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit of research which actually links some of these benefits to the impact of people's health and well-being. The first is daylight and lighting, and daylight is a really important component of a green building for environmental reasons as well, that being able to use daylight instead of artificial light can actually often lower the carbon footprint of a building. But what you might not know is that it also helps your sleep. There's been one study, and more are coming, to show that actually office workers who work near windows sleep 46 minutes more on average per night than those that don't. This is pretty significant. So if you have your staff that are sitting close to windows, they are going to come in the next day more refreshed, more productive likely, and just overall, they're probably going to take less sick days because they're building up this immunity by improved sleep. All the benefits that we know about sleep actually can be significantly affected by the building that you're in. And that leads to a 6.5% reduction in sick leave of employees with good views and suitable daylighting. The reasons for this are still being unpicked, but it has an impact on how you feel, how you think, and also your overall health. So we believe that daylight is one of the most important in improving your health and well-being and the environmental performance of a building. Noise and acoustics, 99% of people surveyed in one study cited impaired concentration when exposed to background speech or noise. So again, something that you need to take into account when you're designing a building. 66% drop in performance when exposed to distracting noise. And I think a lot of us are now finding ourselves in open plan offices, and it's all about how you structure those open plan offices to make sure that sound is absorbed, because it can be a really efficient use of space. So we're not advocating not to have those kinds of open spaces, but just think about the acoustics and how that can have an effect. And that's more in an office setting, but that can also have an impact on homes. Thermal comfort, 3% increase in logical thinking and performance when individual control over temperature. So if you can control the temperature where you're living, where you're working, it can actually improve your thinking performance, your typing performance, and your productivity. A lot of these studies were initially done in buildings, in office buildings, but we're looking at how they also apply to homes. I think one of the most important that also applies to homes is indoor air quality. Common determinants of poor air quality can be caused by CO2, which can be caused by lack of good ventilation, mold and bacteria, VOx, atmospheric particulate matter. So it's really important to understand how is the home that you're building and developing filtering for some of these pollutants that exist in the outdoor air, maybe through plants, ventilation, but also how are you making sure the materials that you're using in the house aren't causing any of this. So making sure that the paint you're using, the carpets that you're using aren't creating noxious fumes, which can actually have a negative effect on the inhabitants. And this is really important. The indoor air quality, we've seen that in a green building, there can be 30% fewer sick building symptoms and better environmental perceptions. So this idea of sick building syndrome, when you spend your time in a building that is unhealthy for you, that is contributing to illness that you're having. And we've also found in a study, which I'm going to come on to, that there's a doubling of cognitive scores in enhanced green buildings over conventional buildings. And this is a pretty major finding, that you can be in a green home or you can be in a green office building, and your thinking is going to be better purely because of the way that you've designed and you've built the home or the office building. And this is pretty major because I'm sure you're all kind of understanding that this equates also to the value. So if this is having that kind of effect on the performance, the way that you're living in a building, surely then those kinds of homes are going to be worth more and in higher demand than those that have the negative effects. And this is really important to take into consideration. Location and access, this is a great building, isn't it? It's like you can design this amazing building, but it's in the middle of just a tarmac of a highway where there's no access to anything, and it's pretty miserable. And I think it's important when we think about green homes that it's not just about what's inside the home, it's about where the home is situated. And there was one study that came out of the University of Toronto that linked being able to access green space and living near green space to a number of significantly improved health outcomes, such as reduced obesity, reduced cardiovascular disease, reduced depression and anxiety, and improved birth outcomes even because of some of these other effects. So by nature of having the green space near where you're living, you're more likely to use these places. You're more likely to go outside, breathe fresh air, get exercise. And so the amenities close to a home all have this positive effect on the health and well-being. And this is really driving demand. The more awareness that people have of these kinds of linkages, the more they are going to be demanding this from homes that they purchase or rent. And this is a really important trend. And as we're seeing these kinds of things published in mainstream magazines like Elle Decoration, this becomes a mainstream way of thinking, and it starts filtering into the economy. And so these are just some examples of beautiful spaces where you can see how the use of plants, the use of sunlight, the look and feel of a place just affects how you feel about the home. And also the kitchen, improved ventilation. So these are just some examples. I mentioned a study which is actually called, the short form is the COG-FX study. It was done by the Harvard University in the States. And they framed it under something now which they're calling building economics, and basically the economics of a building and how you build it. And the theory was that there had been some research, like some of the ones that we had talked about before, where they would notice that performance and the way that people felt in a green building seemed to be better than a non-green building. But they couldn't really quantify it. They're saying, what is it about this thing and being in a green building that makes you feel better? And we think you're thinking better when you're in a green building. So they did two studies. The first was done in a lab environment. So they actually had created in a lab environment a green building, so the features of a green building, and a non-green building. And they gave individuals a cognitive test. So basically like a really difficult test to test whether you're thinking clearly, how you're thinking on strategy, data processing, these kinds of things. And they actually didn't believe the data when they got it back. And this was done by Harvard, so this is peer-reviewed. They found that there was almost a 300% increase in higher information usage scores. So the way that individuals were processing information was 300% better in the green building. 288% in higher strategy scores, 131% in higher crisis response scores, and 48% in higher focused activity, so how well they were focused. So they said, well, these results can't be right. So we're going to try and now do this not in a lab, but in a real life setting. We're going to apply this in a real green building and a real non-green building. And the results were similar, maybe not off the charts as the first one was, but still very similar. There's 6.4% higher sleep quality scores in the green building, 26% higher cognitive function scores, 73% higher crisis response rates, and 44% higher decision-making scores. There's something in this. So now we're working with them to do a global study where actually we'll compare different green buildings in different markets around the world, because this raises questions. This was done in the US. What if you apply these kinds of green buildings to other environments? Are the studies or the results going to be the same? You can find some of this study on our website at worldgbc.org, but also you can Google the COG-FX study and get the full results. But we think this is a groundbreaking study. And how this relates to is a bit of the kind of obsession nowadays with your apps and being able to track how everything is working for you as an individual. And I just took some shots. This is when I was on a holiday. I had a really good night's sleep. I was able to track how my sleep was. I was at a cabin by the lake, so I was sleeping really well because I was in a happy place. I was in a happy house. There's the My Home app, which is now on Apple, which is kind of linked to everything that's going on in your app. And then you've also got your health data, which is linked to activity, mindfulness, nutrition, and sleep. There are a lot of apps in development which are now linking the attributes of your home and how you're sleeping and how you're thinking, how's your mindfulness activity. And it's all becoming related. And I think this is really important as you're thinking about the future of homes, because these are the kind of apps that are in your future home buyers' hands. And this is the kinds of things that they'll want to see from the homes that they're going to buy or rent. And this is why it's a really important trend to understand. So I think we'd summarize the effects on health and well-being is the main reason that people like green buildings is because green buildings like people. They're good for people. And evidence is now really clear to show this. So we encourage you to take a look at some of the reports that we've put out. We're trying to put out more and more evidence, real-life case studies from companies that are applying some of these 8 attributes in their own work environments. We're hoping to do one on homes soon as well. 2 were done on offices, and 1 was actually done on retail, and showing some pretty amazing results in retail that even you might stay longer in a shop, which has better access to daylight, and you might spend more if you're looking at green plants and biophilia. So these are the kinds of studies that we're going to continue to really understand what is driving this phenomenon. But let's be clear, this is a phenomenon, and it is here, and it's affecting how people are going to buy homes. I think what's also important to us is, to look at millennials and the cohort that are going to be living and working in buildings in the future. So 50% of the world's population now is under the age of 30. That's pretty mind-blowing and staggering to get our heads around. And this study that recently came out from the World Economic Forum basically asked these millennials, in your opinion, what are the most serious issues affecting the world today? And they asked across numerous countries. And the number 1 response was climate change and the destruction of nature. For those that are under 30, this is top of mind. This 50% is very, very worried about climate change, and this is affecting a lot of what they do. It's affecting the jobs that they're choosing. It's affecting the homes that they're going to be living in, the products that they buy. There's an increasing move towards veganism with millennials, partly because of this. So it's all part of a wider trend that they are very concerned about the future that they will have on the earth. And we would say they should be worried, because actually what we are seeing is that emissions are growing from buildings, and they shouldn't be. So right now we know that 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings, both their operations but also their construction. This can be a confusing chart, but it's important to note that if we keep building the way that we're building today around the world, we are contributing to a scenario of 6 degrees of global warming, the results of which would be catastrophic beyond anything that we've seen in our lifetime. But the good news, and this is data that had been prepared with us with the International Energy Agency, the good news is we can get to a 2-degree scenario, and buildings has a key role to play. If we reduce 84 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions from today to 2050 that come from the built environment, if we can reduce those, we can contribute to a 2-degree scenario of global warming, and we hope even get to a 1.5-degree scenario if we can move even faster. And this is really important to millennials, and this is going to affect the way that they live in the future. There's a great article recently in the New York Times by a professor at MIT who was talking about the suburb of the future. And this was going a bit beyond just what's the home of the future, but what's the way that millennials will want to live. And it was actually a live graphic that it was hard to capture, but this is the kind of old version of a suburb with a bird flying, and this is the new version of a suburb with a drone flying in the air. And that's actually meant to be a delivery drone, because they're not going to be driving to their local grocery shop to pick up their groceries. They're going to have a drone delivered to their suburb. There's an increasing interest in design of more of like a teardrop style of road, not the grid pattern, and this enables it to be much more protected from traffic. There's much more trees, a lot of discussion around a plant to pavement ratio. In the old suburb, there's a lot of pavement. You can see there's like driveways, there's a lot more road. The new suburb's all about the trees, because this makes people feel better, but also about absorption. In the future, even under a 2-degree scenario, we're going to be experiencing a lot more extreme weather and a lot more extreme flooding, and the absorption of green spaces becomes really important. Mentioned the drones already, autonomous electric cars, which are going to be much more efficient in the way they get around, but also zero carbon energy. They're going to expect that where they live in the future is zero carbon, because it's entirely possible, so why shouldn't they be able to have that in their suburb of the future? So we found this really interesting, and it does relate to a lot of the work that we're doing right now on net zero carbon buildings. We released a report this year called From Thousands to Billions. And it's talking about the thousands that we believe of buildings that right now are net zero carbon emissions in their operation. So these buildings are operating zero emissions. We have approximately thousands of them. We need to get to billions. Now, we're defining net zero buildings differently than I think sometimes in the past. We'd heard a lot about net zero energy buildings. Net zero energy buildings often require 100% of renewable energy to be on site. And I know there's been a lot of work done on that in renewable. A lot of work done on that here in Norway. And what we've seen from that is that I think it's possible in some scenarios, but we're seeing a lot around the world that some people believe that net zero energy is really difficult. Maybe sometimes you can't put enough solar panels on your roof to provide enough energy that you need for your home. So we're shifting the discussion from net zero energy to net zero carbon. And that means you can have renewable energy coming from your own home, your own building, but you can also have that renewable energy coming from off-site and in your local community. Because what we really care the most about is that we meet the Paris Agreement targets, that we get to 2 degrees. And that means that we have to get to full decarbonization, whether it's on top of your home or nearby in a district energy system, in our view, doesn't matter. What is critical is that the energy that you're using comes from a renewable source, but that you're also implementing significant energy efficiency measures. So our definition of net zero carbon is a highly energy efficient building with all remaining operational energy used from renewable energy, preferably on-site, but also off-site production to achieve net zero carbon emissions annually in operation. We've started with this definition. We're also working towards net zero buildings that are net zero in their construction. We think that's harder and it's a little further away. What is the most urgent is we get to net zero carbon in operating emissions as soon as possible. The numbers really tell us that from 2030, we need to get to all new buildings operating at net zero carbon, and by 2050, all buildings operating at net zero carbon. And this is in order for us to meet the climate targets set out in the Paris Agreement and to reach 2 degrees. So basically what that means, we've kind of done the math, and we have a little ways to go. The global building stock in 2015 was estimated to be 223 billion meters squared. We reckon that about under 0.01% of that is net zero emissions. But what we're saying is that we need to get to 100% net zero by 2050, and considering the growth in construction all around the world, that's going to be 450 billion meters squared that has to be net zero compared to the 0.01%. But we believe that it's entirely possible. And what's important is not just new build, but focusing on retrofitting. And this is really important for our homes as well. So we've done some assessment to say, well, what's the trajectory for existing buildings to achieve net zero carbon going into the future? And basically what it shows is the first blue line shows that if we get started as soon as possible in building new, but also in retrofitting, we'll easily meet that target. But if we wait till 2040, it means that we'll basically have to retrofit all of our homes and all of our buildings in about 10 years to meet the climate targets. So really our message is let's start as soon as possible and we can meet these targets so that we can keep global warming within 1.5 degrees. Next week, we're really excited. It's World Green Building Week around the world. And our theme is #OurHeroIsZero. So I encourage you to all follow us on social media. This is a great picture that one of our agencies that we're working with developed for us. Heroes Stand United. And this is, some of you may have heard of the Energiesprong in the Netherlands, which is now actually operating in the UK and some other European countries, where basically they come with a full package solution for retrofitting homes to turn them into net zero carbon homes in basically 1 day straight. And we think it's really important to start working on some of these policies, these approaches, where someone can ring up and say, I want one of those. I want a net zero carbon home, but I can't spend the next year waiting at home this Friday for the insulation guy to come and then the week later waiting for the solar guy to come. I want someone to come in and do this for me in 1 day flat. And that's what Energiesprong is doing. And we think it's a really interesting business model, and it's really taking off in places like the Netherlands as more of these millennials are demanding that we address climate climate change, that their homes make them feel good, not just inside, but that they feel good about their homes, these are the kinds of solutions that they're going to be demanding. So we encourage you to look up the Energiesprong. I think it's also important to note that investors are looking to net zero too. These are the dragons from Dragon's Den in the UK. It's a BBC program, and there have been a number of green products recently that they have invested in. And I think what's interesting is there is this divestment movement that I'm sure many of you have heard about. Divest from fossil fuels, invest in a green economy to protect our future. A lot of pressure on major pension funds, major investors. To ditch their fossil fuels investments. What's really interesting about this and where we see a massive opportunity is if you're divesting, you're going to need to be reinvesting somewhere. And we believe that investing in green and zero carbon properties is the way of the future because of the reasons that we've been talking about. The interest from millennials, the link with health and well-being, and increasingly productivity. And we're seeing major corporations around the world really invest in green building. And a lot of investors are saying, we are only going to invest in companies that are building green. There's something been developed recently by a company, La Française in France, which is a green REIT, so a green real estate investment trust. And they're saying we're only investing in green real estate, and we're looking at their credentials and how they're doing. And I think this links to some of the certifications and the green building certifications we'll hear about later. But I think it also relates to consumer investment, right? And so one of the projects that we're really involved with at the European Union level is working towards a green mortgage. There's some research that had come out of the US, which actually helped kickstart some of the thinking behind this. And basically it said that the loan performance owners of green homes were less likely to default on their mortgages, and they were more likely to prepay their mortgage. It's really interesting, and a lot more research has to be done. Is it because that you tend to be conscientious? Are you someone that's investing in a green building and a green home because you're conscientious, and therefore you're also going to be conscientious with your mortgage? We don't know exactly. The other thought is, you know what? When you have a green home, your operating costs are much lower, and so you're not faced with huge energy bills month by month, which makes it much easier to pay off your mortgages. And this is why also we're doing a lot of work with social housing. We're working with Habitat for Humanity as an example, because a lot of these NGOs are very interested on the effects of green building on lower socioeconomic groups, because what if they didn't have to pay energy bills? And what if those bills could be next to nothing, but it's also they're living in a home that improves their health and well-being, which can improve so many different kinds of outcomes, right? So I think the link between your monthly costs, these new kind of mechanisms that are being developed by the European Mortgage Federation. This is funded by the European Union. The World Green Building Council is really involved. This could become a financial mechanism in a few years, which would really drive the take-up also of green homes. You mean I can get a better mortgage, maybe a better rate, or I can borrow more money if this is a green home? Why wouldn't you do it, right? So I think this will also really drive the market. And I think another thing which is really driving the market we're seeing around the world is policy. And I think that policy is really being sped up now, the policy to combat climate change, because of some of the extreme disasters that we're seeing around the world. And I think whereas before some of the disasters were felt particularly in the global south, this is now happening increasingly in the global north. I think this picture was taken in Houston, which has really made the mayors across the United States sit up and take note and getting much more involved now in climate policy. If Trump is stepping back, fine, the mayors are stepping forward. You see former Mayor Bloomberg stepping forward, galvanizing city mayors to do more and more. And that's not just in the US, but it's really all around the world. It's a great picture of how many countries, I think we just heard that Nicaragua finally joined the Paris Agreement. They are one of the 3 holdout countries. They've since joined. Every country now is working towards these targets. They're they're nationally determined contributions. And as a third of emissions come from buildings, a third of those nationally determined contributions, reductions, also have to come from buildings. But where this relates to some of the work that you're doing is that's being now translated into policy more at local levels. So a lot of these mayors, as I mentioned, are stepping up and saying, okay, we're seeing that this is where it's headed. We as mayors want to be out in the forefront. We're seeing this. We want to be leading the charge. We believe that this is really important for the future. Our constituents are demanding that we do something, set really ambitious targets. These are just some examples. Santa Monica in California, which is a part of Los Angeles, and you think of Los Angeles as like this, cars all over the place, highways, like a really kind of emission-heavy city. But actually, they've now introduced a policy where single-family duplex and low-rise multifamily dwellings have to be built to net zero energy performance starting in 2017. That's this year, and that's a requirement. Vancouver in Canada on the West Coast, last year they announced a policy where all buildings need to be net zero emissions by 2030 with a phased plan that started last year, and this includes homes as well. And New York just announced, as Mayor Bill de Blasio in Climate Week this week, announced that New York will mandate 14,500 of its least efficient buildings to accelerate and deepen major energy efficiency upgrades. So this is now being required. This isn't just, we're offering some incentives, why don't you do this? These are mayors standing up and saying, we have to do this, and that's translated into policy, which affects homes. And I think that will start changing also the market for homes, because as more and more cities are implementing these kinds of policies, it just becomes accepted that these are the kinds of homes that we need to build for the future. And that's just a start. That's just the climate agreement. And you know that in New York, they're also meeting this week to talk about the global goals. We had some fun creating this infographic. Because we believe that, green homes not only help us meet the Paris Agreement, but they can also help us meet many of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we went through the SDGs and we picked out the ones that we really believed closely related to green building. That includes health and well-being, it includes emissions reductions, circular economy, those kinds of things. But these are all the building blocks that green homes can provide towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we're talking in this language in Global South and Global North about, green building is also about the economy. It's about sustainable and positive development going into the future. And as this becomes more and more mainstream, this has been our most shared infographic ever at World Green Building Council. People are really excited about this, and they want to feel, as we talked about at the beginning, good about where they live and understand that where they live is having a wider impact on the world around them. So I think that's a quick scan of some of the trends that we're seeing in green building. Just a little bit about us. We're over 70 green building councils that work around the world. We're in 5 regions, and that includes Norway Green Building Council that joined us recently. Through all of those members, they have their own members, companies like yourselves that are participating. That whole family, we call it the family of green building, is 32,000 members of green building councils around the world. So we're in major, major countries, 5 regions around the world. And our work I've really talked through, we focus on healthy buildings, net zero carbon buildings, deep renovation. We've run a big retrofit project in Europe. Green cities, we're really focused on how do we support policy development, and also how do we support country signatories to the Paris Agreement in meeting their NDCs through buildings. And those are some of the work that we're doing. So we invite you all to work with us, World Green Building Council and the Norwegian Green Building Council. And I think the last thing that I wanted to leave you with is to remember that this isn't just about, being good for the planet because you feel good about it, but this is actually common sense. It's profitable. This is a great ad that we developed a while that, this is some of the profit, commercial sense, and bottom line is some of the shocking language that you'll hear green builders use. And that's because what we know from this research is that a happy house is a profitable one, that more and more people are demanding these kinds of homes, and this is going to translate into your bottom line. So I think that's the key takeaway that we'd like to leave you with today. But I think at that, we'll open up to some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Terri. I must say, for my own part, some of the facts you've given us today are shocking. Yeah. Some of them are inspiring. Yeah. And I think that there are more than one person in this audience thinking, Now I realize why I've been sleep deprived.
Yeah.
I never had a good
After
window
today.
at work. But, you know, if I can ask you one question before I go to the audience. Are you sure you're not advocating against open office? Really?
Advocating
Are you-
against
yeah,
open offices?
yeah.
Absolutely not. Yeah,
Well,
we
Most of us love our own
I-
offices.
Oh, right. Okay, advocate. You love your own offices. I think both absolutely
Okay,
work.
good. Oh,
I mean,
yes.
I think it depends on how you build, right?
Yeah.
Because and how you design. You can design having your own offices and still have access to daylight,
Yeah.
right? So I think, there are ways of having it so that, you use windows. So you might have a corner office, which I'm sure everyone aspires
yes,
to.
yes.
But maybe your office walls are window as well, right? So that the sunlight that you're getting directly is also flowing in the rest of the office and not blocked. So we're not saying you have to do away with your corner offices, but we work in an open plan office at our in London, and the team just absolutely love it. But
Do
yeah,
they?
yeah, maybe
Yeah.
one day I'll get a corner office too.
Oh.
I can only dream. Yeah.
And then you get rid of the noise from everyone else.
So there are definite pros and cons, and we're not
Yeah.
saying one either way, but just keep in mind if you do those closed off offices, figure out how to give more access to daylight to more of the people, even if they're not in those offices. Yeah.
Okay, we've got some questions from the audience. One says, who are we when you're talking about that 90% of our time is spent indoors? I think the person wants to remind you that you're in Norway,
Okay,
like in
no,
Canada.
fair enough. Yeah. No, it's true, actually. Yeah, no, I mean, being Canadian, I think I can understand that. And actually, it would be, I've never actually done that for myself. I definitely know during the week, I spend most of my time in buildings, but maybe on the weekends and on my summer holidays, more time outside. So we'll revisit that statistic and find out if it varies country to country, but appreciate you're all an outdoorsy bunch like we are.
We are.
Yeah, still, it's a lot of time spent in buildings.
It is. And then one person says, how do you measure all the improvements? What do you measure them up against?
Yeah.
Is it on a national level, or is it what exactly what?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we encourage usually a pre-occupancy study and a post-occupancy study for very specific buildings, because it's I mean, even that, it sometimes is hard to isolate the details, but have a look at some of our reports. But what we ask the companies to do is say, okay, what are the key changes that you're implementing in this building? And what do you think will have the most effect on your people, or you're hoping? And then how do you design a survey pre and post, which will evaluate those? So we'd also usually encourage the survey to start while you're designing the new fit out or the new building, because then you can have in mind, well, okay, I'm going to introduce more daylight in the next version. So we're going to do the pre-occupancy study in the building with very poor daylight, and then we're going to do a post-occupancy with the good daylight and see how that might be affected. I think the most challenging work that we have ahead of us is to really unpick the attributes. So you might have a green building where you've introduced better daylight and improved air quality, and how do you know exactly which is affecting? And and I think that's why some of the lab studies that are done with Harvard are going to be really important to keep working with them, because some of it may have to be done in a lab in an isolated setting where you can control, right? So that's why we're working with the academics and the professionals on that. So it's good questions, though.
And as you were saying, most of the buildings in Norway as well as in Canada are not green buildings today. So what is the time perspective? At what will you be alive when they're all green buildings?
I will.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's going to
Will
happen
I?
really soon. Absolutely. I think it's really starting to happen, and we're not just saying that because we're the World Green Building Council, but we had there was a week in Climate Week this week in New York where major companies came and announced some pretty fantastic initiatives that they're launching. JP Morgan, a major bank in the United States, is in the process of implementing a massive net zero carbon retrofit of all of their buildings. One of their buildings is the second biggest in the US next to the Pentagon, and they're making it net zero carbon. And JP Morgan, I mean, they're tight with their money. I have to say, they have a lot of money. And one of the guys from JP Morgan sits on our corporate advisory board, and he has to asked us some tough questions. But when we showed him the cog effect study, he was like, I finally have a business case that I can take to my CEO and say, this is why JP Morgan needs to invest in green building.
Well done,
So
JP Morgan.
so we think it's really, there's a groundswell that's starting to happen.
And it's starting to grow.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And then one more question, well, two more. There is high focus on recycling the energy usage in buildings, e.g. through passive houses. Does this support your different criteria for healthy building, or do you see any areas of conflict?
There can definitely be areas of conflict, and that's why, you know, it's really important to look at the whole picture with health and well-being. We've done a blog recently on air quality where we've looked at that, and we do believe that you can have more natural ventilation is going to improve air quality, but sometimes that can actually lead to maybe you need to increase some of your energy use. So I think you have to look at the design in the round, and you have to look at the health and well-being as well as energy. But I think our view and why we're shifting to a net zero emissions language is that I think passive house can be really good. And, you know, I'm not an expert on passive house, but if you find that sometimes the features are going to sacrifice health and well-being, using a bit of energy that comes from a renewable source is going to be okay because, you know, from an emissions perspective, that's possible. So I think what we really worry about is if you go so far in focusing on this has to be net zero energy, that you sacrifice some of the health and well-being principles, which means in the future no one will want to touch a net zero home, right? So you have to look at it in the round, and that's why we're opening up this dialogue. Think about all attributes, work with your design teams to say, okay, if this health and well-being attribute is going to have an impact on environment, how do we address that and how do we incorporate it? Because you can do both, you just have to think about it and design for it. And so join the debate, and, you know, if any of you want to contribute blogs on this or some of the challenges that you've seen, but we think it's better to have that discussion rather than sort of bury it under the carpet, because the very green carpet. But yeah, I think that's important. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have, I have to what? Yeah, we have a couple of more questions.
Okay, yeah.
Do you include a discussion of architectural quality in your buildings evaluation? Does that come into it at all?
I think the architectural quality, it relates to so many different things that we talked about, right?
Aesthetics.
Like it's aesthetics. We talk about the look and feel. Yeah. I mean, the look and feel of a building is really important. If any of you have read the book, The Architecture of Happiness, it talks a lot about how you feel when you look at a building. And yeah, we think it is really important. And I think it's also why, you know, I love the Energy Sprong work, because I think we often encounter perceptions that people are like, oh, these like net zero emissions buildings are like really wonky looking, and I wouldn't want one of those, right? And I think some of the old ones were like some of those buildings built in like the 80s and 90s, like just kind of look a bit like Jetsons or something. So I think now it's actually really important that we think about the aesthetics, because that's what people care about, right?
Exactly.
But it's really important to prove that you can have the aesthetics, but you can also have all of those green components, and doing one doesn't mean sacrificing the other. So it's important, yeah.
Can you also talk a little bit to us about the different obstacles facing different countries in the quest towards greener buildings, and how that would assist in providing solutions for these problems?
Yeah, it's so different country to country. I mean, you have to look at climatic. I mean, Norway is similar to Canada in that way that, you know, you extreme winters where, you know, you need a lot of the heat load is so important. I know, you know, Canada and their work on net zero emissions has been doing a lot of work on that. In other parts of the world, it's the opposite, right? It's how do you give access to daylight actually when the daylight is so strong that it can actually lead to really uncomfortable situations in buildings. I think what's really personally very interesting to me is some of our work in Africa, where there are a lot of concerns in Africa that they are starting to rely on a lot of Chinese companies coming in and using kind of new world development tools, like, okay, we're bringing in tin and we're bringing in wood in some countries where actually they don't have many trees, like Namibia. And actually some of these green building councils are working locally to figure out how do we reuse almost ancient architectural techniques and building materials. So there's been a resurgence of the use of earth homes, like we were in Morocco the other year for the COP22, and they gave us a tour of these new earth homes that are being built. And earth is actually one of the best insulators. Like, it keeps it cool in summer and it keeps it warm in winter. And you might not need to rely on these kind of new technologies, but actually some of these old techniques from history are now seeing a resurgence. And that's why we believe so much in the local Green Building Council model, because we don't want to set, a global framework for like, this is how every country must build, because you have to work with your local, your climatic, political situations and understand what's actually going to be feasible. So, yeah.
Do you think Norway has a specific role in developing the environmentally good homes and offices, as we have been made rich on oil and gas and all that?
So,
You think so?
absolutely. You have this opportunity to show
Hører dere
your
det?
leadership around the
Det er
world.
vi som skal gjøre det.
Yeah, and I really honestly, I think a lot of people around the world look to Scandinavian countries for leadership in these areas, right? And you're seen as very progressive in so many areas, and I think including on hopefully climate change. So I think it's a real opportunity to show your leadership, but also it's going to be a great and growing market, in the future, that there are countries that might be further behind that are going to be looking to those countries that are leading and coming to your companies and saying, we have to do this because now we've had this policy introduced last week and we don't know how to do this. Can you help us, right? And so it's a great export opportunity we see as well. Yeah.
It's been mind-blowing listening to you. It's fantastic.
Well, get involved. Get a green home.
Will you come back next year or something?
Maybe,
I
yeah.
have no
Depends how many
authority
green homes you build in the meantime. Yeah.
But it's really been a wake-up
Great.
call for
Well,
us. And it
thank you
was
so
great
much. Some
having
great
you.
questions.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Thank you.